Good evening, everyone. It is my honor and pleasure to be here with you tonight for an exciting Human Rights Speaker Series event. Hi, my name is Pauli Murray, and I am just so excited for this conversation to happen in our community and for all of our panelists that you'll get to meet tonight. Just going to be a thrilling conversation. This is, as I mentioned, part of our Human Rights Speaker Series, and I want to thank our staff who make the Human Rights Speaker Series possible. This is an ongoing tradition in the city of West Hollywood for us to engage on critical topics, often related to our social justice mission. And Winston's trying to say hi, so I'm sorry if he appears on camera, but I know you guys love him anyway. And I just want to thank our panelists, everyone who has spent their time and invested their hard work and dedication to making this happen. I'm just honored to know that for 3 short years of my life, I shared the same planet as this wonderful person we're going to learn so much more about tonight. And her work, her leadership, and her service truly inspire me. And after tonight, you'll know exactly why. So tonight, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Councilmember John Erickson.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Horvath. It's great to be here with you in what I will call National Organization of Women Excellence, from where we'll learn more a little bit about Pauly, and it's great that you were able to. For women, yes, for women. And thank you so much for introducing us. I'm so excited. Hello, everyone. Councilmember John Erickson. Great to be here with you all tonight for tonight's exciting program, and it's going to be a great discussion. Before we get started, remember that we will have a Q&A period, and if you have questions at the end, you can send them to arts@weho.org, and we'll read them off during the panel, and people will be able to answer them. So tonight, we're going to be welcoming some amazing panelists who are going to be here talking about the incredible Pauli Murray. And I say incredible because of knowing their legacy, but you will learn soon why. First, I'm really excited to introduce Barbara Lau, who's the Executive Director of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. Barbara's bio is extensive and amazing. And Barbara connects her commitment to justice with her belief in power of community practice through her work as a lead developer of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. Barbara's 20 years of experience as a folklorist, curator, professor, media producer, and author include curating the exhibition Pauli Murray, Imperfect Crusader, Dude, Priest, producing To Buy the Sun, an original play about Pauli Murray, co-directing The Face Up, telling stories of community life, community mural project, and teaching documentary courses about Durham history and culture. Barbara earned a BA in Sociology and Urban Studies from Washington University in St. Louis, and an MA in Folklore at the University of North Carolina. Barbara has written many journal articles, exhibit catalogs, and children's books. Welcome, Barbara. Nice to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be with you too.
Wonderful. Next up, we have Bryce Cracknell, who's an impact producer from Participant. Bryce is a passionate storyteller and an award-winning social impact producer from North Carolina. He has led social impact campaigns for narrative and documentary features and television shows, including Flea, amazing show, My Name is Pauli Murray, John Lewis, Good Trouble, Just Mercy, and When They See Us. As a storyteller, Bryce aspires to elevate narratives, histories, and experiences that are often overlooked, cast aside, or forgotten. Bryce is a Morris K. and Stuart L. Udall scholar and graduate of Duke University, where he earned his BA in public policy. Welcome, Bryce.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And last and certainly not least, we have Talayla Bridges McMahon, producer of My Name is Pauli Murray. Talayla is an award-winning director and producer who has made documentaries for PBS, CNN, ABC, and Amazon. Previous projects include directing the Emmy-nominated PBS series Black America Since MLK and Still I Rise, and co-producing the African Americans Many Rivers to Cross, which garnered Emmy, Peabody, and DuPont Columbia awards. She also produced Makers, Women Who Make America, which is one of my favorite series, and contributed to the Academy Award nominated documentary feature Operation Homecoming, writing the wartime experience, as well as Emmy nominated specials for ABC News. She has a BA from Emory University and an MA in journalism from the University of Southern California. Delela, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me and having this event.
I am so glad. We have a lot to talk about tonight, and welcome to all the people watching as well. It's great to be here with you all. I want to start off, Barbara, and then open this question up to everyone because it's a jam-packed one. Barbara, I started off by saying the incredible Pauli Murray, right? Tell us how incredible Pauly was and why we should all know who Pauly is and why she is so incredible. And then Bryce and Delela, please jump in afterwards.
Yeah, I'll just get us started because this would easily take up the entire time that we have. Pauli Murray, the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, was just an incredibly brilliant 20th century human rights activist whose work as a legal theorist, whose work as a creative writer, whose worked as an activist have impacted the way that our society is today. Pauly imagined new ideas, coined the term Jane Crow to begin to talk about intersecting oppressions, worked very hard to make sure that sex was part of the Title VII, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, was the first African-American woman ordained as an Episcopal priest, grew up in Durham, very shaped by the family and community in which they sort of thrived and were challenged, right? Learned a lot from the local African-American newspaper editor about writing and media campaigns, challenged discrimination in education, challenged discrimination in public transportation. There's a quote from a pretty prominent women's historian that said, when looking at 20th century America, all roads lead to Pauli Murray. So because of the unique human being that Pauli Murray was nurtured and became, they really began to envision a world in which someone like themselves, someone who was gender expansive, someone who had same gender relationships, someone who kind of pushed against the boundaries in many of the communities that they were participating in, could thrive, could contribute. I think it's a world that we all want to live in. So we have Pauli Murray to thank for some of that thinking, some of that activism, some of that leadership.
Wonderful. Whoever else wants to jump in right away. I know we got a lot to talk about.
I mean, I'll just chime in. That's really great, Barbara, that whole very comprehensive portrait of Pauly. And I'll just say that for us, the filmmaking team, the way in which we came to Pauly's story was really because the directors, Betsy West and Julie Cohen, had made a documentary film about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, and it was called RBG. And it was really Justice Ginsburg saying to the filmmakers, I really stand on the shoulders of a person named Pauli Murray. That's really who I credit with a lot of my thinking about how I argued for gender equality at the Supreme Court. And so when Betsy and Julie started looking into Pauly, they saw that Pauly had been sort of impactful and really sort of at the forefront of so many things. So in addition to influencing Justice Ginsburg, Pauli Murray actually helped to shape the legal argument that the NAACP used to argue for Brown versus Board of Education, which led to integrating schools. And so there are really all these different ways in which, Pauly really laid the legal framework for paving the way for gender and racial equality in our country.
Yeah, and that's a great documentary about RBG, nevertheless, and how they connect. Bryce.
Yeah, I mean, we were fortunate enough to work with the filmmakers on RBG when Betsy and Julie brought Pauly's story to the late Diane Wireman. It was an easy yes. And so exciting to sort of see how Pauly's story came to life. And I'm sure Talia will get to talk about this a little bit more, just the amount of hours that Talia spent sort of just in the archives looking into Pauly's story. And what's so beautiful about the film is that it's told in Pauly's own words. I first learned about Pauli Murray when I studied at Duke University, which is in Durham, North Carolina, where Pauly grew up and is where the Pauli Murray Center is, where Barbara is working now and leading that incredible center. And going around the city, if you all haven't been, you just see murals with Pauli Murray's face and quotes all over the city. And so it really opened my eyes to someone who was well ahead of their time in just about every aspect of society, whether it's issues of gender, sexuality, race. Pauly had their hands sort of in it, shaping the world that we now live in, and it's really aspiring to a world that we hope to sort of become. And so I am a big believer in Pauly, and I'm so excited that this film is out there and that we're having this conversation.
And big shout out to Julie Cohen, who follows me on Twitter, and I got to talk about to a bunch of many years ago when RBG came out, and the other director as well. But such an incredible film. So I want to start off by talking about an issue that I think resonates throughout the film, and that's how the politics of Pauli Murray really apply to what we are experiencing today when we talk about intersectionality, when we talk about identity politics, or when we simply talk about these things on our names right now, our pronouns, right? I asked this question to you all prior because I wanted to make sure I was respectful of Pauli's legacy and their memory. And I said, what pronouns would you refer that I would you think would be appropriate that I refer to when talking about Pauly? And you both all gave very great answers. And so I want to open this up to you, to Leah, to Barbara, to Bryce, and maybe explain this a little bit more. And it is in the film, so it's not a spoiler alert right to there, but really how that kind of applies to the larger narrative we're having. Maybe Leah, do you want to go first?
Sure. I will say that when we were making the film, it was really in the process of making this film that our evolution, we really had an evolution in the way that we were thinking about Pauli's pronouns. For people who don't know, Pauli Murray for so long was perceived to be a woman and was assigned female at birth. But if you go through Pauli's archive, you can see that there are records where Pauly is writing to doctors saying, I know I appear to be a woman, but I'm actually a man. And Pauly was seeking testosterone treatment. And so we know that Pauly could have very easily would have been, what we would identify as trans today. And so it has started a conversation around what are then the appropriate pronouns to use for Pauly. And it's especially true for, Pauly has family that still exists, and they still, so many people, Pauly has nieces and nephews, and they refer to Pauly as Aunt Pauly, and they use she, her pronouns. And because this wasn't something that Pauly shared openly, even Pauly's friends had no idea that this was even part of Pauly's identity.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people in the film, especially people who knew Pauly, are using she and her pronouns. And even for historians, a lot of people feel like they don't want to necessarily be presumptuous and choose different pronouns for Pauly, because Pauly isn't really here to choose pronouns for themselves. And so it's really just sparked a conversation about what is appropriate at this point in time, because on the flip side, what we came to understand is that we don't necessarily want to confine Pauly to the limitations of the language that existed in Pauly's lifetime. Yeah. And so what we don't know is what Pauly would choose today. And so in general, we try to use Pauli Murray's name as much as possible. But then we also, because you don't know, right, what Pauly would choose, we also use they, them pronouns often for Pauly, because it just acknowledges that we don't know.
Does anyone want to add on to this conversation?
Sure. I just want to share in a recent conversation with some longtime scholars and some more recent scholars looking at Pauli Murray's material, one of the issues that they also brought up was that Pauly, especially as a young person, was fairly religious, pretty devout as an Episcopalian. And this idea of gender expansiveness came into conflict a bit with the teachings of the church, especially then, right, in the 20th century. And so this discernment process, I think, was long and often troublesome, right? It raised, when Pauly found himself attracted to other women, feminine women often, trying to find a logic that helped to understand that and didn't necessarily go against some of Pauly's faith beliefs, I think was really a challenge. That said, I also think that, I remind myself that Pauly was born in 1910. So this is before women could vote. This is before women could lead really independent lives, especially women who weren't women of means. this is, women were still considered property of their husbands when they got married at this point. Between that time and when Pauli Murray passed away in 1985, the idea of what it meant to be a woman, the idea of what women could do, how women could present themselves, the kind of careers women could pursue, the sort of public facing, public speaking, leadership roles opening to women changed dramatically. So I think there are a lot of factors in thinking about that, but I want to agree also with Talea that we don't know, right? And I think the thing that we at the center think about is how using multiple pronouns is a way to open a conversation about gender, to avoid making assumptions about gender, and to invite people into not making those assumptions about anybody else that we all come into contact with as well.
Such an important point. Bryce, did you want to add on to this?
Yeah, real briefly. I mean, even though we don't know, Pauly was such a disruptive force in every institution that she entered, every room that she was fortunate enough to be involved with. I mean, Pauly just in every aspect of their life changed the way in which those places worked, and often for the better. And we have so much to thank Pauly for in that regard. And Pauly, what came from the church, the Episcopal Church, but also that's where she sort of left. She returned to the church. She got her degree in divinity and became one of the first, correct me if I'm wrong, Barbara, the first Black woman identifying person to become a priest at the church. And so Pauly returned to that place of faith, and it made sense to Pauly at the time to just sort of do that. And so sort of understanding Pauly in context of history and context of these time periods, but also knowing how Pauly also occupied the place of being the first and the sort of challenges that come with being the first person in these spaces, and inherently also just being someone who's disruptive in these spaces by virtue of their very existence.
And it's in just to say, it's in Pauly's sermons, John, that we see the most, the broadest, most expansive, most open view about the ways that people can show up in the world. So I have to say that platform, that possibility really gave Dr. Murray, Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, the opportunity to really share with the rest of us what they were thinking.
I want to highlight and come back to this idea of being the first, right? Oftentimes, the firsts are the people who history forgets. And I think with Pauly's case, we see how many people forgot Pauly, right? And a film coming out in 2021, right? It came out late 2021, but we're, where it is, whatever month it is and whatever Zoom world we live in currently, right? Is fascinating, right? Of course, there are people that know who Pauly are and uplift them. And I always appreciated that about RBG, among many things, right? That RBG said, first and foremost, I stand on Pauli Murray's shoulders. So let's get that clear. That's allyship, in my opinion. But so many people forget about Pauly. But I think they're being awoken to what Pauly's legacy is. But can we also talk about the first that we forget? And in terms of Pauly's case, we look about the first in the terms of the religiosity, being, the first ordained priest in that way. The first person to do all that they did with the law, right? We look at, when we think about the National Organization for Women, we oftentimes forget about Pauli Murray, right? We think about Betty Friedan, a white woman over a woman of color who actually did all the work. And sorry, but that's how I feel. But can we talk about the first? I mean, Talea, can you talk about how you weave that into the film and why? I saw it in the film, but maybe talk a little bit about that from the filmmaker perspective, and then maybe Barbara from the historical perspective, and Bryce, why we got to hit that hard as an impact person and why that matters.
I will say for us, we were sort of blown away by all the things that Pauly did before they were the things to do, right? And so especially people who were born with Pauly's various identities. So someone who was born Black in the South, who was assigned female at birth, who's going out into a world that is not set up for this person to succeed in really so many ways. And so Pauly, in addition to being officially the first to do things like, as we have been talking about, being recognized as the first Black woman to be ordained an Episcopal priest, Pauly was also, one of the first people to protest on a bus, before Rosa Parks, and we weave that into the film. Pauly led a sit-in DC in the 40s. We think about the sit-ins of the 60s. Most of us aren't aware that there were people who were leading organized sit-ins at lunch counters, decades before, and Pauly was doing that. Pauly was the first Black deputy attorney general in California. There are just so many ways in which Pauly was breaking ground. Pauly was the first person at Yale Law School to get a JD. And so for us as filmmakers, it was very important, because we were so impressed with Pauly, to make sure that the audience, we couldn't even work in everything, but as much as possible, we were really wanting the audience to have the same reaction we had, which is why don't most of us know about Pauly? As you acknowledge, there are people like Barbara who have, known about Pauly for so long. And even Bryce, I will say it's rare for me to be on a call, and it's lovely, with people who came to Pauly's story well before I ever did. So we don't at all pretend to be people who have, quote unquote, discovered or uncovered Pauly's story. We are joining a long list of people who have been pushing for and advocating for more recognition of Pauly's contributions. But at the same time, we did know that, for the most of our audience, they wouldn't know Pauly's story. And so it really was important for us to create, these markers of Pauly breaking ground in different ways. And when you see the film, you'll see that we sometimes flag it very explicitly. And so we have these animations that are saying, 15 years before Rosa Parks, this is Pauly protesting on a bus and refusing to move to the back of the bus, and just trying to highlight all the ways in which Pauly was really ahead of the time.
Wonderful. Barbara.
Yeah, I think one of the things that this helps us to begin to understand is how social change actually happens, right? That it comes, it takes a long time to get to February 1st, 1960, where the sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina takes off across the South, and we have college students, sitting in at lunch counters and starting a national movement. Pauli Murray was also involved in the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation, which was a precursor to the Freedom Rides. So part of it is we begin to see that the way change happens means that people try out these ideas, things that no one else is doing. They want to test them. They want to see, well, what can we learn by doing this? And it takes a while before we reach the point at which, this kind of the circumstances of the society and the activism of the people really kind of, ripples out into places around the country. And so Pauly helps us think about, well, what does it mean to think about things in a different way? What does it mean to take a different approach, or say, folks have been trying this for a long time, but I want to, this is the perfect example is Brown v. Board. You have the lawyers at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund really working to try to make sure that schools are equal, places are equal. Pauly comes along and says, this system of separate but equal is inherently unequal. We'll never win using this strategy. They laugh. They bet against her literally in law school. But, Pauly has this foundation of these women who raised Pauly after their mother died when they were a small child, who really, they didn't always like what Pauly did or who Pauly brought home, but they loved Pauly. There was never a doubt that they weren't in Pauli Murray's corner saying, you go, you are who you are. We will support you no matter what, even if we're scared. Pauli Murray comes home to North Carolina and tries to go to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1938. It isn't until the early 1950s that African Americans are admitted to the graduate school there. And her mother, her Aunt Pauline, is terrified that they're going to, burn the house down, literally, that this is going to happen because Pauly is challenging the status quo, writing newspaper articles, bringing attention to this fight. But that's the whole thing, is that Pauly was pretty courageous, but also inventive and thinking beyond what other people, other strategies, not saying, well, how can I get involved in this? It's like, no, let me think about how I see this or what I think might work. And I actually think that Pauly's having these identities that aren't part of the mainstream is part of what opens up those possibilities to see the world in a different way. So we learn to also from Pauly to see these identities and experience that we often view from the oppressor's point of view. The person's being discriminated against, they're fighting against discrimination. We don't see that as a positive, as, oh, this opens up a new way to see the world. So I think in that sense, Pauli Murray is often the first as a thinker, as a strategist, and sometimes also as a doer or an activist. But it's really important to begin to use Pauli Murray's life story to help us understand how change has been made and how we can make change in the future.
That's so important. And Bryce, how do we bring this into impact? How do we make the theory into practice, which we're going to talk about next, because Pauly was real good at that. But how do we do that, and why is it so important?
Yeah, I mean, so learning and sort of sharing Pauly's story is so important for all the reasons that we've covered thus far. But I often think about young generations that are now growing up and wrestling with parts of their identity that we are now just beginning to be able to define, whether it's our queerness or gender nonconformity or transness, that we're sort of just, that society is just now beginning to sort of understand and accept, at least in the mainstream circles, that we look back into history to see who may have also occupied these sort of identities, who may have also held these sort of positions or understanding or things or thoughts in our being that so many folks sort of either struggle with or that society generally struggles with. And so we can look back and see that there is someone named Pauli Murray who was that person in so many ways, and Pauly knew that they were that person. Pauly left a record of these things. Pauly left a record of some of the most just personal notes to doctors, to friends, to and letters to lovers that many of us probably wouldn't even share with our close friends if we were in the similar position. And so Pauly knew that these things were like, that society was changing. Pauly hoped that we would have generations that would be willing to accept a more universal and sort of more broad sense of how we identify ourselves and with one another, and sharing that history and sharing Pauli Murray as a person and what they were able to do over the course of their life and what they're still doing just by the nature of their existence, and keeping that record is so important for all of us and for young people and generations to come.
So important. And when I think about, some of the things that I've seen about Pauly, I remember seeing Pauly's face on an amazing sign at the Women's March in 2017, right? And I was like, oh, people are going to ask who that is, because a lot of people won't know, right? Because they had a Pauli Murray quote on it, and people are going to be like, who is this person, right? And that's where these things start coming about with young activism, and it's young queer people and people who really want to live in the world that Pauly dreamed of and tried to make a reality. But I want to talk about some of these issues that Pauly was talking about way before they were cool, right? Right before they were on Kimberly Crenshaw's mind, when we talk about issues like intersectionality, right? It's the word we all heard about in 2020 when we are standing up for Black Lives Matter, right? Which I would also then question some people have rightly forgotten about with our current political climate, right? But how we have to remember that through these legacies, right? So, Talela, when we think about how you wove in such a complex idea into a film, I thought you did it beautifully. I think the film is beautiful, but can you talk about how you really took some of these really big theoretical issues that Pauly really addressed, spirituality and sexuality, gender identity in 1930, in the 1930s and 40s. How did you approach that problem, and then how did you identify to put it into the film?
Well, I will say Pauly made it really easy in some ways, right? That Pauly was writing and thinking and really experiencing so many of these things. It's not random that Pauly was pushing forward for racial equality specifically. It's not random that Pauly was pushing forward for gender equality. These are both issues that Pauly came to because of Pauly's lived experience. So it was really, Pauly would have been, it seems like Pauly would have been like a poet and a novelist. And, Pauly's main passion was writing. And so there are all these creative pursuits that Pauly most likely would have devoted their life to, but actually faced racial discrimination and suddenly saw that as a place to be challenged. For the beginning of Pauly's life, Pauly kept being kept out of institutions because of Pauly's race. And that's what led Pauly to go to law school. Pauly ends up at Howard Law School, which is an all Black, historically Black university, and then faces gender discrimination. People are saying, you're a woman, what are you doing here? Why would you even bother with this? And they are laughing at Pauly's ideas. And so suddenly Pauly is like, oh, I will also experience gender discrimination. And so it's really through Pauly's personal story that we're able to take these big ideas and really explain them very clearly. It's really at Howard Law School where Pauly coins the term Jane Crow, which we all talk about as intersectionality. But for Pauly is saying we're all here dealing with racial issues, but we also have to deal with, as a Black woman, I am dealing with racial discrimination and gender discrimination. And Pauly really uses that term Jane Crow as a play on Jim Crow to talk about both of those identities.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, Bryce.
To pick up on what Talea was talking about, I really think the important thread here is Pauly's lived experience, which, because they were a writer, they documented through journals and so much correspondence, right? Pauly kept a lot of carbon copies of things. So you have lots and lots of correspondence. And so this lived experience, it's like Pauly wanted to do what other people wanted to do. Pauly had to support themselves because they were an independent person, right? So you want a real job that gives you the ability not just to support yourself, but your elderly aunts that have raised you, other family members. Pauly wants to be in love and have relationships and be close to people. Pauly almost got kicked out of Howard Law School because of an affair they had. They did kind of get kicked out of Camp Terra, which was a women's CCC camp, because of their politics and because of a relationship with a young woman there. So, when you think about that, it's sort of like, well, Pauly isn't different than anyone else. Pauly wants to live a good life. Pauly wants to have impact on the world, wants to change the world so that it's more open, more promoting more. I mean, Pauly was a huge supporter of democracy, right? And human dignity. And so, these things don't seem unreasonable when we think about them now, but when you put them into the context of the 20th century, you start to see where, right, homosexuality is illegal until 1975. There is no way, had Pauly been publicly claiming that identity as a queer person, that they would ever have become a priest, right? I mean, we don't see the first gay priest being accepted until, decades and decades later. But when we look at Pauli Murray's life through that lens, Pauly is smart, Pauly is accomplished, Pauly loves school, gets, like 6 degrees during their lifetime.
Only 6.
Yeah,
Only
but
6.
Wants to pursue these avenues, has really amazing ideas, an amazing work ethic. Pauly works all the time. Like when did Pauly sleep? When you look at the amount of writing, it's like, I don't know. Pauly wants to be a good family member. Pauli Murray wants to be a good Christian. When you think about those things, all these other things make sense. And it also then really foregrounds all of the structural barriers that white supremacy and patriarchy have put in the way of a human being really just trying to live a good life. And so, looking at it that way also then invites us to validate and live into our lived experience and say, even when the world doesn't support us, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't want what we want, to live, good lives as individual human beings and in communities.
I want to kind of talk a little bit about Pauly's queerness in a way. because I think there's this part of the film that resonated with me so much is when Pauly discovers love, right? I mean, Pauly's got a lot of great love in her life, right? And whether that's familial love, communal love, or the love that she finds within people, but specifically with, and the name just left me. So,
Rini.
Thank you. Correct me, because my brain is foggy from being sick. But it's that type of beautiful love that kept her going, you know, and it's so documented, right? It's like for so many things, some of the stuff that was read on the film is just like, oh, okay, we're saying this publicly, right, Bryce, to your point, right? But it's beautiful. But then I also see the pain that not being able to be open about that with especially her religiosity, because she was a very Christian person, right? But I think she already saw that what we think is a disconnect being a powerful connect for that, right? Can you talk a little bit about, and Bryce, I'm going to start with you, about the impact of her queerness, and maybe we can go around through everyone about what that means now, what that meant then, but then ultimately, when we think about Pauly's identity as a whole, you know, we don't want to boil it down to just these little things, but how does this weave into a narrative to make her story more powerful?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question, and that I think there's still a lot more to sort of be discovered and understood from that perspective. I mean, for most historians probably approach Pauly from the gender of Pauly being a woman and seeing Pauly through the lens as a woman. But of course, Pauly's more than that. And then, of course, folks also approached Pauly and being one of the first Black people to do X, Y, and Z. Pauly was Black and she was mixed in sort of many other ways, and grew up in the South and was raised by her grandparents and aunts. And so there's so many other sort of identities and cultures that are mixed in Pauly. And so when we understand queerness, I think that's what makes the most sense, because it's just so different and it's just so diverse and it's just so broad and universal in sort of how we can understand Pauly, but also not put Pauly into boxes. Pauly is someone who's beyond category and just about every part of our imaginations. And so I think it's exciting to know that such a person existed so profoundly, and that in each of us, that's something that we can sort of aspire to exist so wholly that we don't need to put labels or terms on these things, but instead be able to operate in a world in which all of these things can be sort of accepted and true, and not sort of held down by systems and structure that law and society sort of place. And so Pauly represented that in many ways. And as we sort of continue to understand Pauly's history, life, and legacy, I think that's a discussion that we'll sort of continue to have.
Whoever wants to go next.
Well, I just want to add to that to say that I think it's important for us to acknowledge that Pauly was a very private person. And so in Pauly's life, Pauly wasn't actually very open with most people about any woman that Pauly was interested in dating or any actual relationships that were happening. And for much of Pauly, most of the people who knew Pauly would have probably said, there seemed to have been like an unspoken understanding among people that Pauly was a lesbian, is perhaps the language they would have used at that time. It's not an identity that Pauly necessarily identified with, but that's an idea that people sort of projected onto Pauly based on their understanding of Pauly's life.
Yeah.
But what we discovered in the archives is that even though Pauly was not very open with most people about these relationships, Pauly wrote about it. It's something that Pauly intentionally left in the records. And we should say that Pauly's records were intentionally left at Schlesinger Library. This was something that Pauly prearranged. And what became clear to me as a person who was spending a lot of time in the records is that they were highly curated. And so there are letters and diary entries and other things where names are blacked out. There are pages ripped out. And so what we're seeing is what Pauly wants us to see. And so even though this isn't necessarily something that Pauly was sharing with people openly at the time, there does seem to be a faith that eventually the world would catch up to Pauly, and that people in the future would know how to understand Pauly's life better. than people were able to at that time.
I love that. I'm going to have to do that with all my letters to my lovers and say, up, 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 right? But I think that just speaks to their genius, right? That I think at a certain point, you're onto something, right? And that that these things are going to be saved. And obviously, when you go to the Schlesinger Library and your archives are there, well, people are going to read it when you're probably gone, right? But also what you just said, being a private person, Pauly also then respected that about others.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important piece. Barbara, you said you could speak about Pauly for hours. So I know this is a hard question for you.
No, there's 2,500 folders of material at the Schlesinger Library. So there's a lot to go through. And I agree that I think Pauly knew that there was going to be a time when this material was going to be important. Somehow, Pauli Murray knew in their lifetime that their life was important, and said, that they were happy that they lived long enough to see a few of their lost causes found. Not all of them, but a few of them. And I think one of the things about Pauly's queerness that's also really important is, again, Pauly wasn't, so different. Pauly was devastated when relationships ended. These are the moments when we see Pauly choosing sometimes to seek mental health care, choosing to be in mental health care facilities, going to bed for a week, right? Trying to figure out how to deal with this loss, and not necessarily being able to show. But I think there's a couple of things that are really significant. There is in the archive a letter and a kind of a information about what Pauli Murray shared when Renee died. So as part of Renee's funeral, I think Pauly really retreated. This was a huge turning point. Pauly leaves a tenured position at Brandeis to go back to school and seek a divinity degree. So this is a huge turning point in their life, but they leave behind this letter apologizing to Renee's friends that they had just completely removed themselves, and talking about what it meant to lose this partner in life. And I do think, so one of the ways Pauly is able to go on to get this degree is with money that Renee has left them in a life insurance policy. When Pauly is ordained, they are wearing Renee's cross. There's this way that this choice to become a faith leader is a piece of carrying forth a joint goal. And, again, here's another area where Pauli Murray is pioneering sort of the idea of chosen family. Pauly is buried in a joint gravesite where Pauly, their aunts, Renee, and Renee's mother, they're all buried together. Their names are all on a single headstone. So Pauly leaves behind evidence, whether it's in the archive or on the headstone, about who their chosen family was, who was important. Again, way before, this is 1985, you don't necessarily hear about other people doing this. And yet, cannot really be open, is, for whether that's personal reasons or political reasons, right, is attacked by McCarthy, loses a job at the OEO in part because of their sexual orientation and their gender nonconformity around dress. All these things, there's been an undercurrent throughout Pauly's life that if they were more public about any of this, the repercussions would be even more severe.
Yeah. And when you think about the laws and the transformation of the world that Pauly saw, I mean, they lived through some stuff, right? I mean, they lived through, obviously, what we have is Jim Crow. We have before the white women could vote. First of all, I want to be very specific there, and all of the disenfranchisement of people voting in general, the civil rights area, the free love movement, the 60s, the 70s, and then a move to conservatism near her end of her life with post-Cold War and how that all looked with this idealization of the nuclear family that we saw people exploit in a way for harmful things that people would use against Pauly, right? If you went to Los Angeles during this time, there were laws on the books that required 3 layers of the same gendered clothing that you had to wear, otherwise you could be arrested, right? That impacted so many members of the queer community or anywhere else. But another question I have is, how have people reclaimed Pauly now? I know we have this film, we're gonna love it. Well, I've already bought it and I've already seen it, so there you go. But spoiler alert, right? But how have you seen other communities really say, Pauly, that's my girl. You know what I mean? Like, that is someone that is now my idol. They are my insert feminist icon here that we normally would have associated with, right? Like, how have you seen different communities reclaim her? And anyone can start off with this question.
I mean, I'll say that for us, one of the things that was surprising and really encouraging working on the film is that we found out that at Harvard Library, the Pauli Murray collection is the most requested collection that they have. And there's just been such great interest among the students themselves to know that a person like Pauli Murray existed. And what's great about Pauli Murray is that so many different communities can actually see themselves in Pauly's story, whether that's related to race or related to gender identity, whether that's related to sexuality. I mean, just in so many different ways. You could be Southern. I mean, there's just so many things about Pauly's life that people connect to. I think even if you're just a pioneer, right? If you're a person who's like looking to push issues forward in terms of social justice, I think Pauly is a great example for so many people about how to think about that. As Barbara was saying early on, Pauly understood that the work they were doing was part of a continuum of work that had happened before and that hopefully would continue. And Pauly really did take the long view. One of the things that we try to get across in the film is that Pauly is not well recognized during Pauly's lifetime. And Pauly is very aware of this, but doesn't seem upset, because Pauly seems to have a belief that the ideas that they're pushing for are part of a longer, bigger movement that other people will carry on.
Yeah, and Bryce, it kind of goes back to what Talia just said about your film that you worked on, When They See Us. When people see heroes, icons, people like Pauly, it changes your whole life, especially when you're not I'm a white cisgendered gay man, right? And I see myself in society all the time, right? And that's how we acknowledge our privilege and our positionality. But Pauly was saying, and I think you said it so beautifully, that playing that long game, and whether or not she was here for the long game, is something that I think that they really understood at a certain time and knew why it was important for other people to see who they were. Barbara, Bryce, I interrupted with interjection, but whoever wants to go next.
I'll start and I'll lead you in, Barbara. Just the experiences that we see, and just knowing that those experiences are valid, and looking back and knowing that these experiences mean something. Pauly, while being private and wrestling with so many things, personal and sort of society at the time, knew that her experience is worth sharing and her experience is worth recording. I think in terms of like communities that are reclaiming or claiming parts of Pauly, it's super exciting, whether you are someone who's working in law or someone who's working for issues of gender and sexual justice here in the United States, or even issues of racial justice, and even Pauly's brief stint in West Africa and the sort of work that Pauly was involved with there. I mean, there's so many parts of Pauly's sort of like life and career that I think we can all share. Something that always has inspired me is just how Durham, North Carolina has reclaimed Pauly in so many ways. And much of that is thanks to the work that Barbara and the Pauli Murray Center have done over the last decade and some change, and sort of like really leaning into Pauly's story, leaning into Pauly's sort of childhood, where Pauly grew up, where Pauly's founding sort of experiences were had in Durham, North Carolina, and with the family members that are there and the community members that are still there that knew Pauly and knew Pauly's family. Durham is really just holds that sort of rich history and is a place where people can go back to learn more about Pauly. As a part of the Just Mercy campaign, something that we often told folks to do was to go to Montgomery, Alabama, visit the sites and memorials in Montgomery that the Equal Justice Initiative has sort of put out. And it's extraordinary because you get to walk through and see these things firsthand and really just sort of feel it and sit with it and speak with the community members that have also like just grew up with this history, have family that are a part of this history. Durham is hoping to do the same thing, and the Pauli Murray Center is really setting forward to do that. And so go to Durham, visit the Pauli Murray Center. Barbara, I'm going to leave that with you.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce. We do want to welcome all of you at the center. So I think we have to remember that Pauly was well known in the mid to late 1940s, was getting national press. And then, right, there's, you have these moments along the way, founding of NOW, of becoming an Episcopal priest. But it's 30 years later that we have two major books come out about Pauly, and they just don't stop. There's still books in the pipeline. I often tell the story that I bought a book that was published in 2006, a collection of Pauli Murray sermons and writings. I think it cost 39 cents. It costed $1.99 to ship it, right? It was a used book. If you go online and try to buy that book today, it's thousands of dollars. So there is really, I think there is just in general, a lot more interest. People who want to read about, understand, as Talea was saying, there are a lot of young scholars now in the archive writing about Pauli Murray. The material just keeps, and they're finding new insights. I think another way that we're really seeing this is that ACLU's work in the Supreme Court to protect the rights of trans people, all of that sits on the fact that sex is part of Title VII, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And we have Pauly to thank for advocating really hard for that. So we see Pauly's legal strategies continue to be relevant and useful in today's fights. But for us, it was interesting today. I was talking to a healthcare provider who talked about why knowing your history could be like a protective, quality of your life, right? How this could enable you to live a better life. And when we look at memorials, monuments, historic sites, the numbers are devastating. Less than 2% of the 95,000 sites on national registers are focused on African Americans. Recent research has shown that less than 5% focus on women. And so, we aren't lifting up people like Pauly. We aren't investing in those stories and those places that help keep a Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray on the landscape permanently. And that's what we're trying to do in Durham with Pauly's childhood home, which is now a National Historic Landmark. We're working hard to renovate it, add exhibits, experiential activities on the grounds, a new welcome center, so that it can be a place where Pauly's story is available for people to come online or in person to learn more about. And then just enacting that, we're planning our 10th anniversary in June, and part of that is going to be a Pauli Murray pilgrimage, where people will be able to walk from the house to where Pauly went to school, because Pauly refused to ride the public buses because they were segregated. So you get to walk in those, as Pauly would call them, proud shoes, and experience, the choices that we all have the opportunity to make every day to resist the things around us that we think are unfair, unjust, to sort of carve our own path into the world that we all want to live in. And we hope that the center will be a place that continues to inspire people, not just to learn about Pauly, because while that's really great and lifting up Pauly is really important, if we don't pick up the baton from Pauly and continue that work, we aren't really honoring Dr. Murray. And so we want to find that really exciting and engaging ways to encourage people to keep at it, to keep pushing us all toward that, that world that really, right, we all want to be able to live and love and thrive in. So I think all those ways are ways that Pauli Murray's work continues. And there's now Pauli Murray chapters of the Union of Black Episcopalians. There's people talking about other monuments and memorials in Baltimore, which is where Pauly was born, and in other places. legal groups, LGBTQ legal groups, really lifting up Pauly's name. It's happening in a lot of places, and frankly, it's just really exciting. I mean, we're really busy right now because there are a lot of people who want to learn more, and so we're just thrilled to be able to, do what we can. We joke about how it's the Church of Pauli Murray, and everyone's welcome to join.
We love this church. Big shout out to the ACLU as well, who has done a lot with Pauly's work. I would be crucified in my spare time. I am the president of the board for the ACLU of Southern California. So big thanks to all that work. One question from the audience, and then we got to wrap up because it's almost 7 already. When was the first time you heard about Pauly? So Bryce, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I shared it a bit briefly, and just when I first went to Durham and saw the murals of Pauly. There's I think 5, 6, 7, a handful all across the city on various buildings, and you just sort of stumble upon them. Some of them are pretty humble and sort of their appearance, but the artist did such an incredible job of sort of invoking so many parts of Pauly at different stages of Pauly's life. So there's a mural with Pauly's face as a young person to all the way up to Pauly's face as an older person, and different quotes that are just so special, and the colors that the artist uses just make you want to sit there and just stare at these pieces for a while. And so that first opened the door, and then I saw the one woman show about Pauli Murray's life when I was in Durham. And then there was a massive protest that took place when I was on campus, where a statue of General Robert E. Lee was removed from the chapel, the interior part of the chapel entrance. And many of us were sort of advocating for replacing that statue with the statue of Pauli Murray. The university chose to leave it empty as a point of conversation. Maybe they'll change that in the future and choose to put a statue of Pauli Murray in that entrance.
Whoever wants to go next.
I can say that it's funny, looking back, I realized that I'd first seen Pauli Murray's name just as a byline when I was in college in my first feminism course. It was a journal article that Pauli Murray had written, but that did not stick with me, and I didn't know anything about who that was. I just could read that article. And then when I was working on Makers, Women Who Make America, we were researching groundbreaking women, and Pauli Murray's name came up. But at that time, we were specifically looking for women who were alive and could tell their own story. And so in that research, I do remember thinking, oh, this is a very impressive person. But again, it was a person who I was learning about just really in a limited way, just really in the context of their work in feminism and in women's rights. And it wasn't until Betsy and Julie, who I'd worked with on Makers, when they reached out to me to say, we're thinking about making a film about this person, Pauli Murray. I don't know if you've heard of them, and they went through all the things that Pauly had done, that I really came to know Pauly.
And Julie retweeted the thing that I just tweeted her before the panel started. So she's aware this is going on. So we're good.
That's great.
Barbara, bring us home.
Yeah, I learned about Pauli Murray from their neighbors in the West End neighborhood of Durham, where it's a small African-American, primarily working class neighborhood where Pauly's family home is, where people knew Pauly's aunt. There's still people alive who had Pauly's aunt as their teacher at Lion Park Elementary School. And it was really folks in the neighborhood who had come together to form something called the Southwest Central Durham Quality of Life Project, 6 neighborhoods. And one of the areas in which they wanted to work together was to lift up their history, their celebrations, and their traditions. And so that was where I met people who said, you really need to read this book, Proud Shoes. Like, it will help you understand our neighborhood. It will help you understand why we have had so many amazing people grow up here. It will help you understand the Fitzgerald family, Pauly's family, and Pauli Murray. And it's an amazing book. I mean, it's just a beautifully written book. And so that happened, and I knew about Pauli Murray and knew kind of some of the rest of it, but it wasn't until the mural project. And then in 2011, when folks in the neighborhood said, hey, that house Pauli Murray's grandfather built, they're going to make a parking lot out of it. Can you all do something about that? Like, we need to rally people together to save that space. So sort of, we knew Pauly was well known in the community, but I don't think we quite got the gravity of the impact that Pauli Murray had on our entire nation. And it was in that process of talking to neighbors and also learning more about how to really save this place that was so important in Pauli Murray's life that helped me really understand the depth. And then, I got to do what Talea did. I got to go to the archive a couple of times and sit there with things that I knew Pauli Murray wrote. And Pauly had this really bless Pauly's heart for any researcher. Pauly had very nice handwriting. So you have no trouble reading it and really getting this sense of who this person was. And that was, the day would go by and I'd be like, oh, it's 5 o'clock and they're kicking us out of here. Like what happened? So yeah, I think that on a lot of levels, that was how Pauli Murray took hold of us, our group, our board, so many members, people who grew up in the neighborhood that continue to be involved in the Pauli Murray Center, our board chair, Mamie Webb Bledsoe, and said, I'm not letting hold of, I'm not going to let hold of you. You all need to keep this going. So let me just say, Pauli Murray might physically not be on this planet, but it is very clear that Pauli Murray's spirit is still with us and still making things happen, both at our site, but in the world.
And speaking of all of that she's doing in the world, all of you doing this great work, thank you to all of our amazing panelists. That's sadly a wrap. As you can see, we could talk about Pauly for hours, which is great, but you can go and stream Pauly. My name is Pauli Murray on Amazon Prime Video, or buy it. Just buy it. You're going to want it. Just buy it. Click that purchase button. But thank you, all of our amazing panelists, and to all of you that tuned in tonight. And make sure you check out everyone on social and the Pauli Murray Center and all of that. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.